On the morning of May 29, 1979, United States District Judge John H. Wood, Jr. left his townhouse in North San Antonio, Texas, preparing to drive to the federal courthouse downtown. As he approached his car, Wood was struck by a single shot fired from a high-velocity 6mm rifle. There were no eyewitnesses who could identify the person responsible, and investigators recovered only a small number of bullet fragments from the scene. Wood's position made the case immediately extraordinary. He was the first federal judge killed in the United States during the 20th century, and the attack raised the possibility that someone had targeted a member of the federal judiciary because of his work on the bench. The investigation that followed would eventually connect the case to drug trafficker Jamiel Jimmy Chagra and Charles Void Harrelson, a man prosecutors said had been hired to carry out the plan. Wood had served on the United States District Court for the Western District of Texas and had developed a reputation for imposing severe sentences, particularly in major drug cases. That reputation earned him the nickname Maximum John. One defendant who had reason to be concerned about appearing before him was Jimmy Chagra, an El Paso gambler and narcotics trafficker facing serious federal charges. Chagra had been indicted in a major drug case and was scheduled to be tried before Wood. According to the government's later case, Chagra feared the consequences of a conviction before a judge known for lengthy sentences. Federal authorities ultimately concluded that this pending prosecution supplied the motive behind the plan against Wood, removing the judge who was expected to preside over Chagra's case. The timing attracted particular attention. Chagra's trial had originally been scheduled to begin on May 29th, the same date Wood was attacked, although subsequent legal developments had already postponed the proceeding. Investigators therefore had a possible motive, but almost nothing at the scene that identified who had carried out the act. No witness had watched the shooter take position and fire, and the fragments recovered from Wood offered limited investigative direction on their own. The FBI designated the investigation Major Case 21 and gave it the internal name Woodmer. More than 40 FBI field officers eventually contributed resources. Agents conducted more than 6,000 interviews, traced thousands of firearms, and used court-authorized physical and electronic surveillance while following leads extending far beyond San Antonio. The Bureau later described Woodmer as the most costly and intensive investigation in its history up to that time. As investigators worked through the evidence, Charles Harrelson emerged as a central figure. Harrelson had a criminal history that included a previous conviction in a murder-for-hire case, and the government's investigation began connecting him with Chagra's circle. More importantly, witnesses placed Harrelson at Wood's townhouse complex on the morning of May 29th. Prosecutors would later argue that his presence there was part of a much larger body of circumstantial evidence, showing that Chagra had arranged the plan and Harrelson had carried it out. The Fifth Circuit's later account of the case stated that further investigation indicated that Wood's killing by Harrelson had been arranged by Chagra, who was awaiting trial on drug offenses and feared Wood's reputation for severe sentencing. Investigators also developed evidence surrounding the rifle associated with the case. That line of inquiry reached Harrelson's wife, Jo Ann Harrelson. Court records established that she had purchased the 6mm rifle prosecutors identified as the weapon used against Wood. The purchase had been made under the name Faye L. King, accompanied by false identifying information. Her statements about the matter later became part of the broader federal prosecution. The significance of this evidence was not that the rifle alone explained the entire case, but that it provided another connection between Charles Harrelson and the weapon authorities linked to the attack. Combined with witness testimony, communications, financial evidence, and the relationships among the defendants, prosecutors gradually constructed a case from pieces that had initially appeared disconnected. The investigation also moved deeper into the Chagra organization. Jimmy Chagra was not the only member of his family drawn into the case. His wife, Elizabeth Chagra, and his brother, attorney Joseph Chagra, became part of the federal investigation, while Jo Ann Harrelson faced allegations concerning her own actions surrounding the case. Prosecutors contended that Chimichagra had arranged to have Wood removed because of the pending federal prosecution, and that Charles Harrelson had been selected to perform the job. This theory did not depend on a single eyewitness who could describe the entire plan from beginning to end. Instead, investigators assembled testimony, records, and other evidence intended to establish the relationships among the participants and reconstruct how the arrangement had developed. Nearly 3 years after Wood's death, the federal investigation produced major indictments. Charles Harrelson, Chimichagra, and others were charged in connection with the case. Harrelson and Chagra were charged with Wood's murder, while Harrelson, Chimichagra, Elizabeth Chagra, and Joseph Chagra faced a conspiracy charge connected to Wood's official duties. The defendants were also charged with conspiracy to obstruct justice. The prosecution presented the attack not as an isolated encounter between Wood and Harrelson, but as a planned effort tied directly to a federal criminal proceeding. By this stage, Woodmer had generated an enormous investigative record and had become one of the most demanding cases the Bureau had undertaken. At trial, the government faced the difficulty that had existed from the beginning. No eyewitness had actually seen Harrelson fire the shot. The case therefore depended heavily on circumstantial evidence and testimony establishing his movements, his connections to the people involved, and the alleged arrangement behind the attack. Witnesses placed him at the townhouse complex that morning, while evidence concerning the rifle and the Chagra network supported the government's reconstruction. Prosecutors argued that the separate pieces formed a consistent sequence. Chagra faced a serious federal prosecution before Wood, feared the judge's sentencing record, arranged for Wood to be removed, and Harrelson appeared at the judge's residential complex on the morning Wood was targeted. The jury ultimately accepted the government's case against Harrelson. Charles Harrelson was convicted of conspiracy to murder Judge Wood, the murder itself and obstruction-related charges. He received 2 life sentences. The outcomes for the other defendants were not identical. Elizabeth Chagra was convicted of conspiracy to murder Wood and received a lengthy prison sentence, while Jo Ann Harrelson was convicted on charges including perjury and conspiracy to obstruct justice. Chimichagra, despite being identified by the government as the person who had arranged the plan, was acquitted of the conspiracy charge connected with Wood's death. He was separately convicted of tax offenses and was already facing a substantial sentence from his drug case. Joseph Chagra later pleaded guilty to conspiracy to murder and received a prison sentence. These different outcomes are important because the government's account of who organized the plan did not result in identical verdicts for everyone accused of participating. Harrelson and other defendants challenged their convictions, bringing the case before the United States Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit. In 1985, the appellate court reviewed an extensive record covering the prosecution and numerous issues raised by the defendants. The court's opinion described the evidence placing Harrelson at Wood's residential complex, and the government's conclusion that Chagra had arranged the attack because of the federal drug case pending before Wood. Harrelson's principal convictions remained in place. The appellate proceedings also preserved a detailed judicial record of how prosecutors had assembled a case that began with almost no direct evidence at the scene. The investigation of Judge John Wood's death ultimately stretched across years, involved millions of documents and pieces of evidence, and cost the federal government more than $5 million, according to a later history published by the United States Attorney's Office for the Western District of Texas. More than 40 FBI officers had contributed to an inquiry that began with no eyewitness identification and only a few fragments recovered at the scene. Between 1982 and 1983, Charles Harrelson and 4 others were convicted of Wood's murder or charges arising from the wider case. For federal investigators, Woodmer became a landmark investigation not simply because of its scale, but because the evidence established that the attack on Wood was connected to his performance of his duties as a federal judge. Harrelson remained under his life sentences, while the case entered federal law enforcement history as one of the most extensive investigations of its era. Benjamin Bugsy Siegel spent the final months of his life trying to turn the Flamingo into a profitable Las Vegas resort, but on the night of June 20th, 1947, he was hundreds of miles away in Beverly Hills. Shortly before 11 o'clock, Siegel was sitting in the living room of a house at 810 North Linden Drive, reading a newspaper. An unidentified person approached from outside and fired through a window. 4 rounds struck Siegel, who died at the scene at the age of 41. The person responsible disappeared without being identified, beginning an investigation that would produce numerous theories but no prosecution. Nearly 8 decades later, neither the person who carried out the attack nor whoever may have ordered it has been officially established. Siegel had reached California after building a long record in organized crime on the East Coast. Born Benjamin Siegelbaum in New York in 1906, he became associated as a young man with Meyer Lansky, with whom he developed criminal operations before both became connected to the broader organization commonly described as the Syndicate. By the 1930s, Siegel had moved west and established himself in Southern California. His activities included gambling and race wire interests, while his social life brought him into contact with figures in Hollywood. By the following decade, however, Las Vegas had become central to his business interests. Siegel became involved with a hotel and casino project originally developed by publisher Billy Wilkerson, and money supplied by Siegel's associates helped secure a controlling interest in the development. The project became the Flamingo. The Flamingo also created serious financial problems. Construction expenses rose far beyond the early estimates as Siegel pushed forward with an unusually elaborate resort. PBS records that his associates initially supplied about $1.5 million for a 2/3 interest in Wilkerson's project, while the completed development ultimately exceeded that original investment by millions. The Flamingo opened prematurely on December 26, 1946, with portions of the hotel unfinished. The casino failed to produce the expected results during the initial opening, and the property temporarily closed. After further work and additional financing, it reopened in March 1947. This time, the situation improved, and by the end of that month, the Flamingo was generating a profit. The financial history of the Flamingo later became central to one of the principal explanations proposed for Siegel's death. As construction costs increased, his criminal associates became concerned about the amount of money being consumed by the project. Accounts have long circulated that some investors suspected Siegel of diverting funds, although allegations of missing or misappropriated money should not be treated as a proven finding. The important established fact is that the project had gone dramatically over budget, and that this created tension between Siegel and people with substantial financial interests in it. By the spring of 1947, however, the Flamingo was beginning to make money, complicating the simple version of the story, in which Siegel was eliminated solely because the casino was an immediate financial failure. On June 20th, Siegel was back in Southern California. That evening, he and several companions ate a trout dinner at Jack's at the beach in Ocean Park, before returning to the Beverly Hills residence associated with Virginia Hill, the woman with whom Siegel had maintained a prominent relationship. Hill herself was away. At approximately 10:45 that night, Siegel was seated on a sofa in the living room with a newspaper when the attack came from outside the house. Los Angeles Times, reporting based on the case records, states that 4 projectiles from a .30 caliber military rifle struck him. Alan Smiley, a longtime associate who was nearby, survived. The attacker escaped, and investigators did not obtain evidence sufficient to identify the person responsible. What happened afterward helped create the most enduring theory surrounding the case. Siegel's death removed the man who had been managing the Flamingo, and syndicate figures soon assumed control of the property. PBS identifies Gus Greenbaum, Davy Berman, and Morris Rosen as the men who took over the Flamingo after Siegel's death. The rapid transfer of control has frequently been cited as circumstantial support for the theory that Siegel's own criminal associates had approved his removal because of disputes surrounding the resort. The timing, however, does not establish who ordered the attack. No surviving judicial finding or conclusive investigative evidence demonstrates that Meyer Lansky or any other particular syndicate leader authorized Siegel's death. The flamingo theory was only one possibility considered after the killing. Contemporary reporting produced a wide range of competing explanations almost immediately. One concerned control of the lucrative race wire business, which transmitted racing information used by bookmakers. Siegel had been deeply involved in wire service operations in the West, an area capable of producing significant profits and serious disputes. Other reports suggested conflicts involving organized crime interests unrelated to the flamingo, while newspapers also promoted theories centered on Siegel's personal relationships. A Time article published shortly after the event noted how rapidly different explanations appeared, ranging from disputes over bookmaking information to claims that the syndicate had become dissatisfied with Siegel's management of the Las Vegas resort. The abundance of theories reflected the limited amount of verified evidence concerning motive rather than proof that any one explanation was correct. Meyer Lansky became one of the names most closely associated with the speculation because of his long relationship with Siegel and his position within organized crime. Siegel and Lansky had known each other since their youth and had operated together for years before Siegel moved west. Lansky also had connections to the network whose money supported the Flamingo. Later retellings frequently presented the idea that organized crime leaders had collectively decided Siegel had become too costly, sometimes connecting such a decision to meetings among major criminal figures. These accounts helped turn the syndicate theory into the best-known explanation for the case, but they did not establish a legally proven chain from Lansky or another leader to the person outside the Beverly Hills window. The distinction between a plausible historical theory and a solved case remains essential. Investigators also faced the basic problem that the attacker had left without being identified. Over the following decades, several names became associated with the case through claims, recollections, and later accounts, but none produced a prosecution. One later lead involved Eddie Cannizzaro, who was reported to have claimed responsibility. Beverly Hills detective Les Zola, who inherited responsibility for reviewing unsolved cases including Siegel's, investigated the information, but said he could find nothing further that either confirmed or disproved Cannizzaro's account. Without independent evidence establishing his presence and role, the claim could not resolve the case. The lack of a confirmed perpetrator also prevented investigators from establishing the motive with certainty. A financially motivated decision connected to the Flamingo remained possible, as did a dispute involving Siegel's other criminal businesses or personal relationships. But the evidence never reached the point where authorities could demonstrate one explanation and eliminate the others. Contemporary newspapers themselves illustrate the uncertainty. Within days, different publications were presenting different supposed motives with considerable confidence, even though the underlying investigation had not established who had carried out the attack. That early speculation became part of the mythology surrounding Siegel and was repeatedly incorporated into later versions of the story. Siegel's death did not end the Flamingo project. Under new management, the resort continued operating, and its eventual success formed part of the expansion of casino resorts along the Las Vegas Strip. Siegel therefore died at a transitional moment. The development that had created intense financial pressure was beginning to produce revenue, yet control passed to other syndicate-connected operators immediately after he was gone. Those circumstances remain important to understanding why the organized crime theory has persisted, but they do not convert it into a confirmed solution. The official outcome remains much simpler than the many stories built around the case. Benjamin Siegel died at 810 North Linden Drive in Beverly Hills on June 20, 1947, after shots were fired through the living room window from outside. The attacker escaped. No one was prosecuted for the crime, and subsequent attempts to identify the person responsible failed to produce evidence strong enough to close the case. The financial dispute surrounding the Flamingo, conflicts over other criminal enterprises, and theories involving Siegel's personal life have all been proposed as explanations, but none has been established as the definitive motive. The identity of the person who carried out the attack, and whether that person acted under orders from someone else, remain officially unresolved. On November 7, 1997, 35-year-old Sheila Bellush was found dead inside her home in Sarasota, Florida. Her 13-year-old daughter, Stevie, discovered her after returning from school, while Sheila's 23-month-old quadruplets was still inside the house. Investigators recovered physical evidence from the scene and soon determined that the case did not appear to be an ordinary robbery. Sheila was a mother of 6 who had recently moved to Florida with her husband, Jamie Bellush, and their children. She had hoped the move would put considerable distance between her family and a long-running conflict with her former husband, Alan Blackthorne, who remained in Texas. Instead, the investigation would eventually lead authorities more than 1,000 miles back to Texas and uncover a chain of people connecting the person who entered Sheila's home to the man she had divorced a decade earlier. Sheila and Blackthorne had married in 1983 and had 2 daughters together. Their marriage deteriorated, and according to evidence later summarized by the Fifth Circuit, Blackthorne had made threatening statements toward Sheila beginning years before their divorce. They separated permanently and divorced in 1987, with Sheila receiving custody of their daughters. The following decade was marked by prolonged disputes involving custody and child support. Both sides made serious accusations during those proceedings, and Blackthorne repeatedly attempted to alter the custody arrangement. Sheila eventually rebuilt her life and married Jamie Bellush. By 1997, tensions surrounding the 2 daughters had again intensified. After a judge indicated that counseling might be ordered for the families, Blackthorne unexpectedly relinquished his parental rights. Soon afterward, Sheila and Jamie relocated with the children to Sarasota. Blackthorne did not initially know their new address, but he hired a private investigator who located Sheila in Florida. Around the same period, Blackthorne was spending time with Danny Rocha, a golf companion who also worked as a bookmaker. During a trip with Rocha, Blackthorne asked whether Rocha knew anyone who could arrange an attack on Sheila. Rocha said he did not know anyone who would end her life, but believed he could find someone willing to seriously harm her. According to evidence presented by federal prosecutors, Blackthorne agreed to proceed and later supplied Rocha with money as well as information that could be used to identify Sheila. In September 1997, $4,000 was provided for the planned attack. Rocha did not intend to carry out the plan personally. He approached his friend Sammy Gonzalez, and asked him to find someone else. Gonzalez then recruited his cousin, Jose Luis Joey Del Toro. This created the central chain that investigators would later reconstruct. Blackthorne communicated with Rocha, Rocha dealt with Gonzalez, and Gonzalez brought Del Toro into the arrangement. According to testimony presented in the later proceedings, an additional $10,000 payment was discussed if the outcome helped Blackthorne regain custody of his daughters. On November 4, 1997, Rocha met Del Toro and provided him with Sheila's location as well as $500 toward the agreed payment. Del Toro was to receive the remaining $3,500 afterward. Del Toro then traveled from Texas to Florida. 3 days after his meeting with Rocha on November 7th, he went to Sheila's Sarasota home and carried out the attack that resulted in her death. The quadruplets were present in the house, and Sheila's older daughter later returned from school and discovered what had happened. Del Toro had no personal relationship with Sheila and had not been involved in the decade of disputes between her and Blackthorne. His presence in Florida therefore became part of a much larger question for investigators. Why would a young man from Texas travel such a long distance to target a woman he did not know? The answer gradually emerged as authorities traced his connections backward through the people who had arranged the trip. Investigators were able to identify Del Toro and connect him to Gonzalez and Rocha. Within weeks, 3 men associated with the plan had been arrested or identified, while Del Toro fled to Mexico before being taken into custody there. The connections immediately brought attention to Blackthorne because Rocha was not a stranger to him, but a regular golf companion. Investigators also learned that Blackthorne had recently hired someone to locate Sheila after her move to Florida. What initially appeared to involve individuals with no connection to the victim was becoming a structured arrangement stretching from Texas to Sarasota. The investigation was eventually supported by authorities in both states, including the Texas Rangers, whose official account later described the case as a murder-for-hire scheme ordered by Sheila's former husband. The prosecution of the people involved proceeded along different paths. Gonzalez reached an agreement with prosecutors and provided testimony about how Rocha had recruited him and how Del Toro had subsequently become involved. Rocha maintained that the original arrangement concerned an assault rather than Sheila's death, but prosecutors argued that the evidence demonstrated his participation in the broader plan. At his Florida trial, Gonzalez testified about the $4,000 payment and the additional incentive connected to Blackthorne obtaining custody of his daughters. Rocha was ultimately convicted of first-degree murder and conspiracy and received a life sentence. Del Toro, meanwhile, remained in Mexico while authorities worked to return him to Florida. Building a case against Blackthorne presented a different problem. He had remained in Texas when Sheila died and had never personally traveled to the Sarasota crime scene. Prosecutors therefore needed to establish that the actions of Rocha, Gonzalez, and Del Toro originated with him. Federal authorities eventually charged Blackthorne with conspiracy to use interstate commerce facilities in the commission of murder for hire and with causing another person to cross state lines to commit domestic violence. The interstate nature of the arrangement was essential. Del Toro had traveled from Texas to Florida, while the alleged planning and payments originated in Texas. Blackthorne denied responsibility and maintained that the other men had implicated him to reduce their own culpability. At Blackthorne's federal trial in San Antonio in 2000, prosecutors relied heavily on the testimony of Gonzalez and Rocha, along with evidence documenting the sequence of events. Rocha was particularly important because he was the person in the chain who had dealt directly with Blackthorne. Prosecutors presented evidence that Blackthorne had supplied the initial money and later provided the additional $10,000 payment after learning what had happened in Florida. The government also introduced testimony concerning statements Blackthorne had made about Sheila during the years before her death. Blackthorne's defense challenged the credibility of the cooperating witnesses and argued that he had not ordered Sheila's death. After hearing the evidence, however, the federal jury convicted him on both counts. Blackthorne received 2 concurrent life sentences. His convictions did not end the legal dispute. He appealed and later sought a new trial, arguing in part that statements made by Del Toro after the original proceedings constituted newly discovered evidence. Del Toro had indicated that when he initially traveled to Florida, he had not yet decided to end Sheila's life. Blackthorne argued that this information weakened the government's conspiracy theory. In July 2004, the United States Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit rejected that argument. The court concluded that the new information was immaterial to Blackthorne's guilt or innocence, and noted that Del Toro's later actions demonstrated his participation in the conspiracy, regardless of precisely when he formed his intent. The court therefore affirmed the denial of Blackthorne's request for a new trial. The final court record established a chain that began with the long conflict between Sheila and Blackthorne and extended through several intermediaries. Blackthorne supplied money and dealt with Rocha. Rocha used his contacts to involve Gonzalez. Gonzalez recruited Del Toro, and Del Toro crossed from Texas into Florida before going to Sheila's home on November 7, 1997. The federal appellate court described the government's theory as supported by the evidence and left Blackthorne's convictions intact. Sheila's survivors also pursued a wrongful death action after her death. The criminal proceedings ultimately resulted in life sentences for both Rocha and Blackthorne, while the investigation demonstrated how authorities were able to trace an offense committed in a Florida home through a series of intermediaries back to its origins in Texas. On the morning of January 16, 1987, 35-year-old Lita McClinton Sullivan was preparing for an important hearing in the divorce case that had separated her from her wealthy husband, James Vincent Sullivan. Lita was living in the couple's townhouse in Atlanta, Georgia, while James was in Florida. Their marriage had deteriorated into a contentious legal dispute involving property and financial issues, and the hearing scheduled for that day was expected to address the distribution of marital assets. Lita never made it to court. At about 8:15 that morning, the doorbell rang. A visitor carrying long-stemmed pink roses appeared to be making a flower delivery. When Lita opened the door, she was attacked and suffered fatal injuries. The flowers were left behind at the entrance, creating one of the most recognizable details of a case that would remain unresolved for years. James Sullivan was not in Atlanta when his wife died, and investigators did not initially have physical evidence showing that he had been at the townhouse or personally participated in what happened there. Attention, nevertheless, turned toward the couple's difficult divorce and the financial consequences James could have faced if the proceedings continued. Investigators also learned of an unusual telephone call made shortly before Lita's death. Robert Christensen, who lived near the Atlanta townhouse and had previously worked as an attorney for Sullivan's company, testified that James contacted him after years without communication and asked whether he had noticed anything suspicious around Lita's home. Christensen considered the call unusual. The significance of that conversation would become clearer only after investigators learned that an earlier attempt to approach Lita's residence had allegedly taken place just days before she died. Authorities suspected that Lita's death might have resulted from a murder-for-hire arrangement, but suspicion was not enough to establish a criminal case. In 1992, federal prosecutors charged James Sullivan with offenses related to the alleged use of interstate communications in a murder-for-hire scheme. Sullivan was tried and acquitted. That verdict later created a major legal issue when Georgia authorities sought to prosecute him under state law. The Supreme Court of Georgia eventually ruled that the earlier federal prosecution did not prevent the state case from proceeding because the federal offense involved jurisdictional elements that differed from the Georgia charges. The investigation changed substantially when information emerged involving Philip Anthony Tony Harwood, a North Carolina man who had encountered Sullivan while working in the moving business. Harwood's former girlfriend, Belinda Trahan, provided investigators with information connecting the two men. According to evidence later presented by prosecutors, Harwood had delivered furniture to Sullivan's Florida residence in November 1986. The state's case maintained that during this period, Sullivan offered Harwood $25,000 to arrange Lita's death, with part of the payment to be provided in advance. Trahan became an important witness because she described what Harwood had told her about the arrangement and events surrounding trips made shortly before Lita died. Her information gave investigators a route back to a case that had lacked the evidence necessary for a successful state prosecution. According to the account Harwood ultimately gave authorities, the plan did not begin with the flower delivery on January 16th. Harwood said that on January 13th he traveled to Atlanta with two other people identified as John and Tracy. They reached Lita's residence at approximately 5:30 in the morning and attempted to get her to answer the door, but no one responded. The effort was abandoned and Harwood returned to North Carolina. Evidence presented in the later prosecution connected this failed attempt with the unusual call James Sullivan made to Christensen asking whether anything suspicious had been seen around the townhouse. Harwood's account also introduced a detail that closely matched the later crime scene. He said the plan was changed so that flowers would be used as a reason for Lita to open her door. Harwood returned to Atlanta with a man he identified as John shortly before the scheduled divorce hearing. On the morning of January 16th, according to Harwood's account summarized in the court proceedings, they stopped at a flower shop and obtained roses. They then traveled to Lita's townhouse, where John approached the residence carrying the flowers while Harwood remained involved in the operation. John rang the bell. Lita answered, and the encounter ended with her fatal injury. The roses were left at the doorway. Evidence concerning the purchase of the flowers later became part of the prosecution's effort to corroborate the story. The precise description of Harwood's direct role became complicated over the years. He had entered a guilty plea connected with Lita's death, while during James Sullivan's trial, he denied being the person who directly attacked her and disputed portions of the prosecution's version. Contemporary reporting consequently described Harwood's role in different ways, and his changing accounts became a central target for the defense. By 1998, prosecutors had enough evidence to move forward. Harwood and James Sullivan were indicted in connection with Lita's death. Harwood faced charges including malice murder, felony murder, aggravated assault, and burglary. In February 2003, he entered a negotiated guilty plea to voluntary manslaughter and received a 20-year sentence in exchange for agreeing to testify against Sullivan. Court records confirm that this agreement became an important part of the later proceedings against James. James Sullivan, however, was no longer readily available to Georgia authorities. Around the period in which state charges were brought, he left the United States and spent years outside the country. His case developed into an international fugitive search. Sullivan was eventually located in Thailand in 2002 after years beyond the reach of the Georgia prosecution. He resisted extradition, delaying his return further, but in 2004 he was brought back to the United States. By then, nearly 17 years had passed since Lita had answered her door in Atlanta. James Sullivan finally went on trial in Fulton County in 2006. The prosecution did not argue that he had personally appeared at Lita's townhouse. Instead, its case was that he had arranged for others to act on his behalf because of the financial conflict surrounding the divorce. Prosecutors presented testimony from Trahan and Harwood alongside evidence concerning the flowers, the movements of the participants, and Sullivan's unusual inquiries shortly before Lita's death. The defense focused heavily on Harwood's credibility, emphasizing that his accounts had changed and that he denied important elements of the prosecution's description while testifying. There was no simple piece of physical evidence placing Sullivan at the Atlanta residence. The state therefore relied on the combined weight of testimony and circumstantial evidence to establish that he had organized the plan. After hearing the evidence, the jury deliberated for less than 5 hours before finding James Sullivan guilty on March 10, 2006. He was convicted of malice murder and other charges arising from the case. Prosecutors had sought the death penalty, but during the penalty phase, the jury chose life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The court also imposed consecutive 20-year terms associated with aggravated assault and burglary. The felony murder conviction was vacated by operation of law because it involved the same death underlying the malice murder conviction. The verdict came more than 19 years after Lita Sullivan's death. James continued challenging the prosecution through the courts, but his conviction remained in place. The case had moved through an unusual sequence of legal proceedings, an investigation that initially lacked enough evidence, a federal prosecution ending in acquittal, new information from people connected to Harwood, state indictments, Sullivan's years outside the United States, extradition from Thailand, and finally a Georgia trial almost 2 decades after the crime. At the center of that sequence remained the events of January 16, 1987. Lita was scheduled to appear at a hearing concerning the financial consequences of her divorce. Someone arrived at her Atlanta home carrying pink roses and she never reached the courtroom. Evidence developed years later allowed prosecutors to connect that apparently ordinary delivery to a planned arrangement and ultimately secure James Sullivan's conviction. Sara Tokars had already taken precautions before the events of November 29, 1992. Her marriage to Atlanta attorney Frederick Tokars was deteriorating, and according to testimony later reviewed by the United States Court of Appeals for the 11th Circuit, she intended to divorce him. More importantly, Sara had obtained documents connected to Frederick's financial affairs and gave copies to her sister, Christine Ambrusko, with instructions that they should be turned over to authorities if anything happened to her. Those records included information concerning offshore accounts in the Bahamas and a bank chartered in Montserrat. After Sara's death, her family followed her instructions and provided the material to investigators. The documents became part of a much larger inquiry into Frederick Tokars, a former state prosecutor who had become an Atlanta tax and criminal defense attorney. Federal prosecutors would eventually argue that Sara's knowledge of her husband's affairs, combined with their impending divorce and substantial financial considerations, supplied the motive for a carefully arranged murder-for-hire scheme. Frederick Tokars had previously worked as an assistant district attorney before entering private practice. By the early 1990s, federal authorities alleged that he was involved with a criminal enterprise engaged in cocaine distribution and the laundering of proceeds through businesses and nightclubs. Prosecutors said Tokars provided legal and financial assistance to the enterprise and invested money through offshore accounts. Sara's discovery of documents connected to those activities therefore carried consequences beyond their marital dispute. The government's theory was that she had become sufficiently knowledgeable about Frederick's activities to threaten the enterprise if she disclosed what she knew. Money provided another element of the case. In August 1989, Frederick increased the value of Sara's life insurance coverage from approximately $250,000 to $1,750,000. According to the testimony of Eddie Lawrence, one of Frederick's business associates, Frederick eventually approached him about arranging Sara's death. Lawrence testified that the original suggestion was to carry out the plan at Frederick's office, where Frederick believed he could manage the aftermath because of his influence in Atlanta. Lawrence rejected that proposal. Frederick then suggested that it happen at the family home and appear to be a burglary. Lawrence said Frederick offered him $25,000 plus a portion of the life insurance proceeds. When Lawrence remained reluctant, Frederick continued pressing him and, according to Lawrence's testimony, even threatened to damage his business if he refused. Lawrence eventually contacted Curtis Rauer and offered him $5,000 to carry out the plan. Rauer agreed, establishing the chain that prosecutors later presented to the jury. Frederick Tokars had recruited Lawrence, and Lawrence had recruited Rauer. The timing was settled shortly before Thanksgiving in 1992. Sara planned to travel with her two young sons, Ricky and Michael, to Florida to visit her family. Her father later testified that Sara and the boys arrived there on the Tuesday before Thanksgiving and that Frederick flew into Tampa on the same day. Frederick returned home on Saturday and arranged to meet Lawrence the following day. At Frederick's law office, he told Lawrence that Sara had already departed Florida and was expected to reach Atlanta at approximately 8 or 9 that evening. Frederick, meanwhile, was scheduled to be in Alabama to meet a prisoner, a circumstance Lawrence testified was intended to provide him with an alibi. Frederick checked into a hotel in Montgomery and left the hotel's telephone number with his answering service so that he could be reached in an emergency. Telephone records introduced during the case documented numerous calls that day involving numbers associated with Frederick, Lawrence, Sara's father, and the Montgomery Hotel. On the evening of November 29th, Lawrence picked up Rauer at approximately 7 o'clock and drove him to the Tokars' residence. Lawrence testified that he left Rauer there and then waited in a nearby subdivision. Sara arrived home later that night with Ricky and Michael after the Thanksgiving trip. According to the evidence presented in Rauer's case, Rauer confronted the family as they reached the house and forced Sara and the children back into their vehicle. He entered with them and directed Sara to drive toward Atlanta. During the journey, Sara suffered the injury that caused her death, while both of her sons were still in the vehicle. The vehicle subsequently left the roadway. Roa departed and rejoined Lawrence. Sara was 39 years old. Because the two children were present throughout the incident, their kidnapping also became part of the criminal proceedings that followed. The documents Sara had entrusted to her family soon became relevant to the investigation. Her relatives located the material she had preserved, made copies, and delivered it to law enforcement. Investigators were no longer examining only the circumstances surrounding her death. They were also confronting records connected to Frederick's finances and business relationships. Frederick was interviewed by police on December 6th. According to the appellate record, he acknowledged that some of his clients were involved in criminal activity and also acknowledged that Sara had retained a lawyer in connection with a divorce. With his consent, investigators searched the residence and obtained calendars from several earlier years. The inquiry increasingly overlapped with a federal investigation involving allegations of racketeering, cocaine trafficking, and money laundering. Eddie Lawrence became a crucial link between the events at the Tokars' home and Frederick. He eventually pleaded guilty in state court to aiding in Sara's murder and entered a federal guilty plea to a violent crime in aid of racketeering connected to Sara's kidnapping and death. Lawrence stated that he had hired Curtis Rauer at Frederick's request and expected substantial payment from Frederick. His testimony provided prosecutors with direct evidence about the conversations in which the plan had allegedly been developed, the proposed payment, and the instructions surrounding Sara's return from Florida. Frederick denied involvement in arranging his wife's death and disputed the government's allegations concerning the broader criminal enterprise, but prosecutors were able to combine Lawrence's testimony with telephone records, financial evidence, the insurance policy, and other evidence presented at trial. The state cases against the men proceeded separately. A Cobb County grand jury indicted Curtis Rauer and Eddie Lawrence on February 24, 1993, on charges that included Sara's murder. 6 months later, on August 26th, Frederick Tokars was also indicted for his wife's murder. Rauer's first jury trial produced convictions for kidnapping with bodily injury, armed robbery, and 2 counts of kidnapping, but the jurors could not reach a unanimous verdict on the murder count. The trial court therefore declared a mistrial on that charge, and Georgia authorities announced their intention to try him again. This distinction became important in later appellate proceedings because Rauer had not been convicted of murder at his first trial, even though he had been convicted of the related offenses arising from the same incident. At the same time, Frederick faced a far broader federal prosecution. The indictment concerned an alleged criminal enterprise involving racketeering, drug trafficking, money laundering, and violent crimes, with Sara's murder for hire included as part of the government's case. Intense publicity surrounding the case created concerns about finding an impartial jury in Georgia. A federal judge granted motions for a change of venue, and jury selection and trial were transferred from the Northern District of Georgia to the Northern District of Alabama. The federal proceedings therefore examined not only whether Frederick had arranged Sara's death, but also whether his conduct formed part of the larger racketeering enterprise described by prosecutors. At trial, the evidence concerning Frederick's dealings with Lawrence became central. The 11th Circuit later emphasized that the most important evidence connecting Frederick to the murder-for-hire scheme concerned his own interactions with Lawrence rather than the separate dealings between Lawrence and Rauer. Frederick challenged portions of the evidence on appeal, including testimony concerning Sara's statements and Rauer's account, but the appellate court concluded that the evidence independently supporting the kidnapping and the murder-for-hire scheme was sufficient. The court also rejected Frederick's argument concerning his responsibility for the kidnapping, determining that the forced removal of Sara was a reasonably foreseeable consequence of the plan he had helped set in motion. His federal convictions were affirmed. Frederick Tokars ultimately received multiple concurrent life sentences for crimes connected to the murder-for-hire scheme and the wider racketeering, drug trafficking, and money laundering operation. Decades later, the 11th Circuit still described him as a former attorney and state prosecutor serving multiple concurrent life terms for the murder-for-hire of his wife and the associated federal crimes. The case that began with Sara's death on November 29, 1992, had developed into a prosecution reaching far beyond the events of that night. At its center remained the evidence that Sara had preserved before her death, documents she had deliberately placed with a family member under instructions that they be given to law enforcement if something happened to her. After those instructions were carried out, the records became part of the investigation that exposed Frederick's financial dealings, while Lawrence's cooperation supplied the direct connection between Frederick and the plan carried out against Sara. Andre Montgomery Jr. was 21 years old when he died in St. Louis on March 14, 2016. Nearly 2 years earlier, his uncle, James Timothy, Tim, Norman, had obtained a life insurance policy on Andre, with potential benefits totaling $450,000, with Norman as the sole beneficiary. Andre and Norman were both known to viewers of the reality television series Welcome to Sweetie Pies, which followed the family behind the St. Louis restaurant business. What initially appeared to be a local homicide eventually developed into a federal murder-for-hire and insurance fraud case built around phone records, financial transactions, insurance documents, witness testimony, and the actions of several people in the days surrounding Andre's death. The insurance arrangement dated back to 2014. Beginning in October of that year, Norman worked with insurance agent Wally Rebbe Yagnam to submit applications for coverage on Andre. Federal prosecutors said the applications contained false statements concerning Andre's income, net worth, employment, medical history, and family background. The policy that was ultimately issued included $200,000 in basic life insurance, an additional $200,000 under a rider applicable if Andre died from something other than natural causes, and a $50,000 10-year term rider. Together, the potential benefits reached $450,000, and Norman was designated as the sole beneficiary. Yagnam would later admit participating with Norman in fraudulently obtaining the coverage, although the federal judge who sentenced him specifically stated that there was no evidence Yagnam knew beforehand that Andre would be killed. As March 2016 approached, Norman enlisted Terica Tanisha Ellis, a Memphis woman with whom he had previously been involved in a relationship. Ellis had met Andre before and had his telephone number. According to her later plea agreement, Norman told her that he was trying to find his nephew and needed her assistance. In the days before March 14th, Ellis communicated with Andre and told him that she planned to be in St. Louis. Norman, meanwhile, flew from his home in Los Angeles to St. Louis on March 13th, one day before Andre died. The following day, Norman and Ellis communicated through temporary phones that had been activated that same day. Ellis also used a temporary phone to contact Andre and determine where he was. Once she obtained his location, she communicated with Norman, and the information was ultimately relayed to Travell Anthony Hill. Hill later admitted in federal court that he met Norman on March 14th and understood that Norman wanted Andre killed. He also understood that a woman would provide Andre's location. Ellis contacted Andre and caused him to come outside at an address on Natural Bridge Avenue in St. Louis. Phone location evidence placed Ellis near the area at the relevant time. At approximately 8:02 that evening, Andre was fatally shot outside the property at 3964 Natural Bridge Avenue. Hill later acknowledged that he was the person who carried out the shooting. Immediately afterward, Ellis called Norman and began traveling back toward Memphis. Investigators were eventually able to reconstruct these movements and communications through telephone records, location information, witness evidence, and the later admissions of those involved. The financial activity following Andre's death provided another part of the evidentiary trail. Ellis admitted that Norman paid her $10,000 for locating Andre, getting him to come outside and passing his location to Norman and Hill. On March 15th, the day after Andre died, Ellis deposited $3,020 in cash into a checking account at a First Horizon Bank branch in Memphis. That same day, she opened a savings account at the same bank and deposited another $4,340, bringing the day's cash deposits to $7,360. On March 17th, she deposited another $1,900 into her checking account. Her plea agreement identified these deposits as proceeds from the arrangement with Norman. Hill was also paid. On March 16th, he received $5,000 in cash at Norman's direction. That same day, Hill participated in a recorded telephone conversation with a person in jail in which Andre's death and Hill's payment were discussed. Norman also began pursuing the insurance proceeds soon after Andre's death. On March 18th, he contacted the insurance company in an attempt to collect on the policy. Yagnum subsequently made calls seeking to initiate a claim, including a call to Forrester's Insurance on March 30th. On May 21st, Norman submitted a written claim through the mail. The insurer did not immediately pay because additional documentation was required, including finalized police, toxicology, and coroner's reports. Norman continued contacting Forresters between August and November of 2016. The effort continued well beyond that year. In approximately September 2018, Norman retained an attorney concerning the unpaid claim, and the attorney later informed Forresters that Norman had authorized legal action over the delay. As late as September 26, 2019, Forresters advised Norman that it still lacked all of the documentation necessary to decide the claim. Norman never received the $450,000. For several years, Andre's death remained under investigation by the St. Louis Metropolitan Police Department and the FBI. The case entered a new phase in August 2020. Norman was charged federally and arrested in Jackson, Mississippi, on August 18th. Prosecutors alleged that he had participated in a scheme using cellular telephones and payments to arrange Andre's death. Ellis was also charged, while the investigation expanded to include Hill and the insurance-related conduct involving Yagnum. The resulting federal case brought together evidence from events that had occurred over several years, beginning with the insurance applications in 2014 and continuing through Norman's attempts to obtain the policy proceeds after Andre's death. Before Norman went to trial, the other three defendants resolved their cases through guilty pleas. Hill pleaded guilty in June 2022 to conspiracy to commit murder for hire and murder for hire. He admitted meeting Norman on the day Andre died, understanding Norman's intention, receiving Andre's location through the arrangement, and carrying out the attack. Hill was later sentenced to 32 years in federal prison. Ellis pleaded guilty the following month to conspiracy to commit murder for hire. She admitted accepting $10,000 for her role in finding Andre and providing his location. She later testified at Norman's trial and received a 3-year prison sentence. Yagnum pleaded guilty to conspiracy to commit mail and wire fraud for helping Norman fraudulently obtain the insurance coverage and assisting with the claim afterward. He also received 3 years in prison. Norman maintained his innocence and proceeded to trial in the United States District Court for the Eastern District of Missouri in September 2022. During 7 days of evidence, prosecutors presented the insurance arrangement, communications among the participants, temporary phone records, location evidence, payments made after Andre's death, insurance claim activity, and testimony from people involved in the scheme. On September 16th, the jury found Norman guilty of conspiracy to commit murder for hire, and conspiracy to commit mail and wire fraud. The verdict established his responsibility not only for arranging the plan involving Andre, but also for the fraudulent insurance scheme that preceded it. On March 2, 2023, United States District Judge John A. Ross sentenced Norman to life in federal prison. By that point, Hill, Ellis, and Yagnam had all been sentenced for their respective roles. Norman appealed his convictions, challenging aspects of the proceedings and evidence, but the United States Court of Appeals for the Eighth Circuit rejected his arguments. On July 9, 2024, the appellate court affirmed the district court's judgment. The case that had begun with Andre Montgomery's death in St. Louis 8 years earlier had ultimately been reconstructed through a combination of insurance records, bank deposits, telephone data, recorded communications, guilty pleas, and testimony, resulting in federal convictions against Norman and the other participants whose actions formed the sequence surrounding Andre's death. On August 5, 2009, Dalia Dippolito returned to the home she shared with her husband, Michael Dippolito, in Boynton Beach, Florida, and found police officers surrounding the property. An officer approached her with devastating news. Michael had been killed inside the house. Dalia appeared overwhelmed as she reacted to what she had been told, while cameras recorded the scene. What she did not know was that Michael was alive and unharmed. There had been no attack inside the house, and the crime scene surrounding her was staged by the Boynton Beach Police Department. The man Dalia believed had been hired to kill her husband was actually an undercover police officer, and investigators had spent the previous days recording conversations that they believed showed her arranging Michael's death. The elaborate scene outside her home was the final stage of an investigation that would eventually lead to 3 trials and years of appeals. Dalia and Michael had married in February 2009, only months before the police operation. Michael had a criminal history that included a fraud conviction and was serving probation, but the investigation that ultimately focused on Dalia began through Mohammed Shihadeh, a man with whom she had previously been romantically involved. In late July, Shihadeh approached the Boynton Beach Police Department and reported that Dalia wanted her husband killed. Police enlisted his cooperation as a confidential informant and began documenting his interactions with her. Some encounters were recorded, providing investigators with evidence of what prosecutors later described as a developing plan. According to court records, Dalia repeated her desire to have Michael killed and gave Shihadeh $1,200 to help arrange for a hired killer. Rather than finding a real contract killer, Shihadeh was now working with detectives, allowing police to control the next stage of the operation. On August 3rd, Dalia was contacted by an undercover Boynton Beach police officer, posing as the person Shihadeh had supposedly found for the job. Dalia met the officer later that day, and the encounter was recorded on video. The officer made clear that she could stop the arrangement if she had changed her mind, giving her an opportunity to withdraw. Instead, the conversation continued. In one of the recordings that later became central to the prosecution, Dalia emphasized that she was certain about proceeding, describing herself as 5,000% sure. The discussion concerned killing Michael at the couple's home and making the incident appear connected to a burglary. Prosecutors would later rely heavily on this meeting because Dalia was speaking directly to the person she believed would carry out the plan, rather than simply discussing it with Shihadeh. The following day, the undercover officer contacted Dalia again and instructed her to be away from the house by 6 o'clock the next morning. On August 5th, she complied and left the residence. Police then moved forward with the staged crime scene. Michael was kept safe, while officers created the appearance that a serious incident had occurred inside the property. Later that morning, Dalia was contacted and told to return home. When she arrived, officers prevented her from entering and informed her that Michael was dead. Her reaction was recorded not only by police cameras, but also by a crew from the television program Cops, which was filming with the Boynton Beach Police Department at the time. The footage would later become widely known, but at that moment Dalia still appeared to believe that the plan discussed with the supposed hitman had actually been completed. Officers subsequently took Dalia to the police station for an interview. There, investigators gradually revealed that the situation outside her home had been staged. Michael was alive, and the man she had met was not a hired killer, but an undercover officer. Dalia maintained that she was innocent, but police arrested her on a charge of solicitation to commit first-degree murder. Michael had never been physically harmed during the plot. The case against Dalia instead rested largely on what investigators had documented before the staged scene: Shihade's cooperation, recorded conversations, the money connected to arranging the plan, and most importantly, the video of Dalia meeting the undercover officer and discussing what she believed was a genuine arrangement. The recordings soon transformed the case into a national story. Video showing Dalia speaking with the supposed hitman and reacting to the false announcement of Michael's death was released and repeatedly shown on television. The material appeared on COPS and was replayed by national programs, creating extensive publicity long before a jury heard the evidence in court. That publicity later became legally significant. When Dalia's first trial began in 2011, her attorneys were concerned about how much potential jurors already knew about the case and asked for individual questioning regarding their exposure to media coverage. The trial court declined to conduct the questioning in the manner requested by the defense. A further problem developed during jury selection when one prospective juror mentioned in front of the larger jury panel that she had heard an allegation that Dalia previously tried to poison Michael with antifreeze. At that stage of the proceedings, the trial court had already excluded evidence concerning the alleged poisoning. The defense asked for the entire panel to be dismissed after the statement was heard, but the request was denied. The case proceeded to trial, where prosecutors presented the recordings and evidence gathered during the undercover investigation. In May 2011, the jury found Dalia guilty of solicitation to commit first-degree murder. The following month, she was sentenced to 20 years in prison. The conviction did not end the case. Dalia appealed, challenging several aspects of the proceedings, including the handling of jury selection. In 2014, Florida's 4th District Court of Appeal agreed that significant errors had occurred. The appellate court emphasized the considerable publicity surrounding the case and concluded that the defense should have been permitted to question prospective jurors individually about their exposure to that coverage. It also determined that the trial court should have dismissed the jury panel after the prospective juror publicly mentioned the antifreeze allegation. Because the appellate court could not conclude that these errors were harmless beyond a reasonable doubt, Dalia's conviction was reversed, and the case was sent back for a new trial. The ruling did not declare her innocent or reject the undercover recordings. It concerned whether the jury selection process had provided the safeguards required for a fair trial. Before the next proceedings, Dalia's defense also challenged the conduct of the police investigation, arguing that law enforcement had crossed the line into objective entrapment. The trial court held an evidentiary hearing and rejected the attempt to dismiss the charge on that basis. The prosecution therefore proceeded with a second trial. In December 2016, jurors were unable to reach a unanimous verdict, resulting in a mistrial. With no acquittal and no conviction from that proceeding, prosecutors retained the ability to try the case again. Dalia went before a third jury in 2017. Once again, the recorded conversations formed a major part of the prosecution's case. The proceedings also included disputes over evidence concerning conduct that was not separately charged. After Shihade testified for the defense that he did not believe Dalia genuinely wanted Michael killed, prosecutors were permitted to question him about his claim that Dalia had previously told him she tried to poison Michael with antifreeze. The trial judge ruled that the defense testimony had opened the door to that questioning. The jury ultimately found Dalia guilty of solicitation to commit first-degree murder, and she was sentenced to 16 years in prison. Dalia appealed the third trial conviction as well. Her attorneys challenged the admission of evidence concerning uncharged conduct and again raised arguments about police conduct and objective entrapment. In 2019, Florida's 4th District Court of Appeal rejected those challenges. The court determined that some disputed evidence had become admissible after the defense opened the door to it, and held that objective entrapment was a legal question for the court, rather than an issue that had to be submitted to the jury. The appellate court affirmed the conviction and 16-year sentence. Further attempts to overturn the result did not change the judgment. The case therefore ended very differently from the scene staged outside the Dippolito home in August 2009. Michael Dippolito had never been killed, and the person supposedly hired to carry out the plan had been a police officer operating undercover. What began with information provided by Mohammed Shihada developed into recorded meetings, a controlled police operation, and a fake crime scene designed to convince Dalia that Michael was dead. Those recordings provided the foundation for the prosecution, while the enormous publicity surrounding them contributed to the reversal of her first conviction. After a second trial ended without a unanimous verdict, a third jury convicted her, leaving the 16-year sentence that was subsequently upheld on appeal.